Good evening and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Brent Iacobucci, Acting Director of the Kluge Center. Thank you for joining us this evening. If I could ask everyone just to take a moment to silence any electronic devices you have, I'd appreciate that. This program is sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which supports the Library of Congress chairs in U.S. Russia and U.S. China relations. The chairs lead policy-relevant research, programming, and bipartisan legislative discussion on U.S. relations with Russia and China. The focus is on the present state of relations, as well as the public policy challenges likely to face policymakers in the future. Andrew Weiss is our chair in U.S. Russia Relations. He is also the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has also directed and conducted research on Russia and Eurasia for the RAND Corporation, the National Security Council, and other organizations. I'd like to thank Andrew for assembling tonight's panel. Heather Connolly is the German Marshall Fund's sixth president. She's an expert on the Kremlin and its European economic strategy. Rob Lee is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program, a former Marine infantry officer, and an expert in defense policy. The speakers' full bios are in your packets. Again, we are glad to have you here tonight and hope you'll return. We do have a survey that if you could fill that out, that would be very helpful. We use that information to maintain and improve the quality of our programs. I would note that right now we are recording our panelists' remarks, but when we get to the staff Q&A, we will stop the cameras and all that discussion will be off the record. When we get to that point, also feel free to grab dessert at the side tables at your leisure. And with that, I will hand things off to Andrew. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Brent. I'm especially grateful to my colleagues at the Kluge Center, including Dan Torello, who's around somewhere. The honor of being part of the Kluge Center and being in the library is really one of the greatest professional honors of my career. Tonight's panel couldn't be more topical, but I want to start us off by sort of setting a baseline. And I know there's been endless media coverage of the war. I know there's a lot of intense interest, but there's a huge number of unknowns associated with where we're going. So let's just stipulate up front that this is an unprecedented disruptive event similar to 9/11. It is going to have a series of cascading effects beyond just what happens on the battlefield, not that different from 9/11, where the world is now just going to be very different. But the war is not over. And I want to start with Rob, and I'm going to ask him about if we were going to be sitting in this room a year from now, how different would the war look? Or are we entering a kind of period of kind of grinding stalemate? I mean, I don't mean to tip my own hand, but that is, at the beginning of this conflict, I think people sort of thought the Russians were going to roll over the Ukrainians and we'd be in a long-term insurgency with a government in exile. Now we're in something very different. But neither side seems able to really hold decisively the upper hand. I don't know if that's your view, but I'm sort of curious, projecting out 12 months, where are we going to be?
Sure. So the short answer is I don't know, which is probably not the best answer. But I think first off, wars are extremely unpredictable, and I don't think the way this war's progressed, it could have gone different directions depending on decisions made by Russia, decisions made by Ukraine. If Ukraine did not have Zelensky in charge, remaining in Kyiv, it could have been a different war. So a lot of things that could have been different. When we look at the war at this point, right now the focus on the Donbass. What we know is that in the beginning, Russia clearly wanted to conduct regime change. That was a very ambitious set of goals. That failed. Once the battle for Kyiv failed, Russia couldn't achieve those really ambitious set of goals. So they had to kind of reduce them somewhat. I think it went kind of through three phases, where the first was regime change, second was compellence, and a third, it seems it's more about occupation at this point. That's what they're kind of reducing the goals to, because I think that's what they think they can achieve. In the Donbass, it's an area where Russia should have advantages in terms of conventional military power. One of the problems they had in this war was they advanced from too many axes of advance, and they didn't mass their forces effectively, just violating a very basic principle of war. And the problem was they have so much attrition after the first 2 months that now they are, they're resetting themselves in an area where they should be better off. They should have advantages, But ultimately, the attrition they faced was mostly in their most elite units. So the VDV, the airborne forces, naval infantry, motorized rifle units, all those units face very heavy attrition. What that means is it's unlikely Russia can get a local superiority of numbers, numerical superiority, which you need for offensive operations. And right now, the offensive that's going on in the Donbass, they are making some small gains, but it's costly. And as long as Ukraine can manage to not have its forces get cut off and encircled in that area, they really, in my view, Russia can't really achieve strategic kind of gains. And so I think a year from now, it's extremely hard to predict. I think right now we're in a phase where if Russia can't achieve much more in the next few weeks, then attrition will probably be too much for the current Russian military, the active duty military with contract units, and Russia's going to have to make a decision about whether they mobilize, whether they decide to send in conscripts, because ultimately, when Russia invaded with about 75% of its maneuver battalion tactical groups, probably they sent about another 10 or so about 80% are probably right now in Ukraine, committed on one level or another. Some of those are no longer existent, but that's how much they committed. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, they committed about 35% to 40%. So there was the U.S. had a rotation that was available with units, and so it didn't have to have the same units that are committed for the long term. There aren't units for Russia to commit at this point. They've taken units from South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Tajikistan, Kaliningrad. They pull from everywhere. And so basically, in order for Russia to sustain the war, even just as is, even without making more gains, they're going to have to probably make a decision at some point to mobilize, to send conscript units, and that becomes a very hard to predict how that will, politically, how successful it will be, militarily, how effective will these conscript units be. Do they have the equipment? Do they have officers to lead them, NCOs to lead them? That's not clear. And so, 12 months is hard to predict. I think 6 months is hard to predict because at some point, Putin's got to make a decision about how do we continue to sustain this operation. And right now, with just the contract servicemen in the Russian military, I don't think they can do it for too many more months by themselves alone. At that point, I think it becomes very, very hard to predict. But you said, I think the most likely result is it becomes more attritional. The front lines start to not move around too much, and that will likely be the course it goes. But it's a very low confidence, I guess, assessment.
Thanks, Rob. So let me bring Heather into the conversation. Heather, if I'm not mistaken, we have a very special mutual friend who's a great American, former Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, who you worked for at the State Department in the Bush administration. And after 9/11, the U.S. Russia relationship was qualitatively transformed. And Rich Armitage was kind of the point person. We're at another one of those moments where the relationship is being qualitatively transformed, but we're going from this kind of frenemy relationship where there were certain elements of cooperation to something that's really almost purely adversarial. And I'm just curious, again, just taking the year time frame out there, the Ukrainian resistance to Russian aggression is so laudable and so poignant, but we're in this fight in some form. This is not just a Russia-Ukraine conflict. The U.S. is the enabler, the funder, the provider of intelligence and military capabilities to the Ukrainians that have contributed to their lethality, as Rob was just talking about. I mean, there's another person pulling the trigger that brings the attrition into reality, and it's the Ukrainian side. How dangerous do you think this dynamic is going to be between the United States and Russia going forward, now that we are in a, some sort of a almost purely confrontational phase?
Well, Andrew, it's an incredibly dangerous moment because we have a revisionist Russia that's not going to stop at Ukraine. And I think pulling back and with a great deal of analytical humility, which we all need to embrace no matter your discipline, in many ways, we have been in this mode since 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia and occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So we've had 14 years of territorial encroachment of Russia's neighbors. This particular act has now caused us to reframe the entire policy. And no better picture of the countries that are reframing their policy than is Germany in Europe. We are watching, I have to say, as an analyst, I'm watching 30 plus even goes back more, 40, 50 years of German policy just disintegrate in hours. We are contemplating in the next 2 weeks inviting Sweden and Finland to join NATO. Sometimes you can't even grasp the strategic effects, as you said, that are flowing from February 24th. Everything changed on February 24th. So there is no going back. There is no reset that we can have, and we've had multiple resets with multiple administrations that admirably tried to have a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. The 2001, 2002, I think that is where we had a very different Putin, who was willing to make a go of being a partner with the West, and he viewed the 9/11 as a complete reframing of the U.S. Russian relationship based on counterterrorism. Of course, we have such a different definition of terrorism and counterterrorism. But those days are done. We are going back. This is now war crime, if not eventually genocide, to be honest with you. I think we will get to that legal definition at some point. So now, if you believe what Rob, I believe 100% what Rob was saying, what we're talking about is Russia's defeat. That's the flip side of Ukraine winning and Russia being weakened, which is what Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin said just a week and a half ago. We do not have a strategic paradigm to address Russia's defeat, if this is in some ways where this goes, because it's going to be even more unstable, more fragmentary. And even if Mr. Putin survives, doesn't survive, what comes after may be much, much worse than Mr. Putin himself. So that's really, from a strategic standpoint, that's what we have to prepare for. That's why NATO has to thicken its defenses. That's why we have to prepare for that oncoming instability, and that could be a global instability if Xi Jinping decides that he cannot tolerate a Russian defeat because he's signed on to this alignment, and if China does make a decision to support Russia. So again, these broader effects, but we aren't going back. We have to create the new paradigm here, and that's really what we're struggling with, because we're just watching what's happening on the battlefield from a day-to-day basis.
So let's talk a little bit about that new paradigm, Rob. And this is maybe pulling you a little bit out of your comfort zone. And I hope everyone's watching Rob on Twitter, because Rob is kind
He's
of
the best.
Rob is sort of the person chronicling in real time all these manifestations of violence in the region and the capabilities that are driving this war. But let's talk a little bit about Russian hard power for a second, and what kind of military power Russia is capable of generating. In Ukraine, Russia is not using its air force very effectively. It's not using long-range artillery or rockets and missiles that effectively. It's largely this kind of either dash to Kiev to decapitate the Zelensky government, or kind of World War II style movements of tanks and armored personnel carriers that can then get chewed up by the Ukrainians, who are much more nimble and enabled by UAVs or US and other systems. But is that Russia and Toto, or is there a sort of bigger picture of Russian military power that is sort of out there that we need to think about for this kind of 10-year type horizon that we were just talking about? And how big a challenge is it? You know, I assume going to be a tendency to say like, the Russians are such bozos, and like we've seen this comeuppance and the possibility of an outright defeat that Heather was talking about. But Russia hasn't brought all of its military capability into this fight. And obviously we're going to be in a more dynamic, unpredictable world. So I'm just sort of curious how we should think about, how people should think about Russia's military capabilities writ large going forward, especially the things that really matter to the United States.
Sure. So first off, Russia's taking very heavy casualties this war already. And that's in equipment and in personnel. And that's going to be very difficult to reconstitute anytime soon. So we're looking at a timeline of several years before they can recover a lot of these respects. One of the big weaknesses of the Russian military is personnel. So they've been trying to become more of a professional military, moving away from a kind of conscript mobilization-centric military that was the case in the Soviet Union. They've had some success, But clearly the numbers of contract soldiers are less than they've been talking about, and they didn't meet the numbers. And so one thing that's been notable is that the battalion tactical groups that they deployed, Sergei Shoigu said in August they had 168, that was the figure they provided, was that a lot of these battalion tactical groups the personnel numbers are much lower than we thought. It appears they changed the table of organization, so what they're supposed to have in those units to a lower level. So from a motorized rifle battalion, if it's based on BTRs, typically it's about 560 personnel. It looks as though now it's about 350. And when you add attachments, it's larger. But we thought that BDGs, it was mostly going to be 700 to 900 personnel, and now we're seeing 400 to 600 in a lot of cases. So they're much smaller than what we thought before. That shows really a significant personnel weakness. And now those are the troops that have been taking the casualties. And so the longer this war goes on, it's going to be even more difficult to deal with that because one, there's the heavy casualties. Two, the current conscripts are not going to necessarily want to sign contracts, and that's what they rely on. The new conscripts coming in right now, they don't have anyone to train them because they're supposed to get trained in the units by contract soldiers. And so there's a knock-on effect here, and it's not clear how Russia will recover very quickly on recruiting more contract soldiers. In terms of equipment, they've lost a significant amount. They've fired off a large number of their cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. I don't know the percentages, but it's certainly a sizable proportion. They're going to have to completely rework their defense spending. So they do a 10-year state armors program. They're going to have to completely retool that to make up for losses they've had. All those are significant issues. In terms of the weaknesses we've seen, I'm somewhere in between. So they've shown weaknesses that were greater than I thought they were going to have. But there's also a lot of things that contribute to that. That's not just the Russian military. So one was basically the decision to invade Ukraine was kept very close to the vest. So Putin knew, high-level officials knew, but most units did not know until maybe the day of, the day prior. So in terms of logistics, all the kind of planning you do, all those issues we've seen in this war, well, that exacerbates everything, tremendously. So all those things become worse. So that's a big part of it. Part of it is there were very unrealistic goals associated with this war. They were never going to be able to achieve the political goals they set out for. There's always this kind of incoherence, lack of coordination in this plan. So some of those things, there's no guarantee that Russia was going to fight a war like they did this way and put the military in such a position. In some ways, the political level, they set the military up for failure. So all of those are key issues. And I think one other key thing too, and we keep learning more about this, is that the U.S. is providing very important intelligence sharing. And it literally may be unprecedented in modern times of actionable intelligence that Ukrainians can use to then target, key leadership positions. There's news today about the Moskva that the U.S. played a role in providing some intelligence sharing with that. I don't know the full scope of it, so it's hard to say right now. But that's when they go into this war, that it's not just Russia versus Ukraine. It's Russia versus Ukraine plus the U.S. intelligence community providing actual intelligence. That's something I probably didn't expect before. And so all those are kind of things that factor in. I wouldn't say the Russian military is a paper tiger. I think that's going to be an important thing after this is over to not get into that mentality. But it's going to take them a number of years to recover. And we know there are weaknesses in the Air Force and elsewhere in electronic warfare. I thought they'd do better. They're clearly not as capable in those regards than I thought they would be. And so, certainly my assessment will be that they're not as effective as I thought in a number of respects. And that's something important going forward.
Thanks, Rob. So I've got a two-part question for Heather, and then we're very much hoping to bring this group of folks who are part of this conversation into the discussion directly, and there'll be a way for me to call on you if you've got questions. Let's talk about the high-end aspects of Russia's power that really matter in the terms of U.S. national security. Their nuclear, their cyber, their space capabilities. Those have not been touched for the sake of the last 2 months of grinding their conventional forces up. But how worried do you think a more militarized and renegade is the term I'm using, Russia, is going to be for the United States?
Well, I think this is really, again, following Rob's logic, which it's a daunting picture for Russian forces. And if you believe that Vladimir Putin cannot sustain a defeat, then what does he do to break the will of the Ukrainian people? And the way he's been trying to get Europe to back off and sanctions and things like that, he continues to threaten nuclear. That's certainly been the message. This was probably, Rob, maybe it was a month and a half ago. And it was when, I believe it was Putin or Shoigu, basically created a new term of art that, Russia's nuclear forces would be going combat ready. This is not a doctrinal level. We don't know what that is. We didn't understand what that was other than you guys better be careful. And immediately after that came out, the head of Russia's strategic forces said very clearly, it was just a very flat, nothing has changed in Russia's nuclear doctrine. So I interpret that as, we know you're hearing something from the political leadership. I'm sending to my professional cadre, there has been no change in that. And whether that's comforting or not to anybody, it to me said that there was still a professionalization there. But I think this is where we do, as an alliance, have to start thinking and are starting to flow CBN capabilities towards the eastern flank and for the Ukrainians to have. I mean, in the first days of the war, you couldn't buy an iodine pill in Vienna. I mean, they were taking that threat very seriously. But in some ways, the more they keep saying they're going to use this and don't, it starts to lose its power. We are no longer afraid. And look at what the Russians have been, the threats towards Finland and Sweden as they move towards NATO membership. They're not afraid. And so the provoking hasn't slowed the weapons down to Ukraine. And again, I think it did in the beginning. I think the Biden administration was concerned about provoking escalation. They were self-deterring a little bit. And that has now gone away because I think, again, we don't have a policy framework for what we want right now. But we're starting to articulate it. We now don't want just a ceasefire stop. We want Ukraine to win. We want to weaken Russian capabilities so they cannot attack their neighbor again. When you have clear objectives, you can start placing that into some context. But look, we don't know. And we don't know, backed into a corner, if Putin's legitimacy comes into question. They have clearly said if an existential threat to this regime, they will use nuclear weapons. We just don't know what any of that means right now. But we have to be prepared for absolutely every scenario.
So I'm going to do two more questions, and then I hope folks here can start thinking of questions you want to ask Rob and Heather. I'm going to ask one to Rob and then one to Heather. So if you were a Russian infantry officer who had gone through what forces there have gone through and had to think about sort of what the payback looks like, and the fact that that America has sort of brought this upon the Russian military, which is a proud institution and which had a lot of success over the last 10 years in places like Syria and elsewhere, and kind of made its weight felt and also seemed to have benefited from modernization. But if you had to put your former Marine officer self, through what they've gone through, what's the way of thinking, you think, of a comparable person serving in Ukraine, and what are they thinking about doing to us as a result of this debacle?
I think it's a broader question is, how does Russia kind of come to terms with this war? And so one of the big things to remember is that Russian news, when they talk about Ukraine, it's kind of in a paternalistic manner, right? And it's always kind of, Ukraine is kind of like little brother, and it's, and when they talk with the Ukrainian military, it's always they have bad equipment, they're not well trained, all those things. And the same thing with, the Ukrainian leadership, they're weak, they're puppets of NATO, so on. And then, you're shown pretty clear evidence that all of that's not true. And all the things that they're saying about the Russian military, all the hype about Russian weapons, well, they're fighting. They're using almost all these weapons in Ukraine, and Ukraine is not losing. And so it becomes difficult to how do you justify this? So it's an issue for the military, issue for the political leadership, everyone. One of those could be, well, this is all NATO. It wasn't Ukraine, it was NATO that defeated us, and so on. That might become, that likely will become a part of the kind of, the way they kind of comprehend this in the lesson they draw after that. In terms of the U.S., I'm not sure. I think part of this too is that anyone in the Russian military who's in this war, they almost certainly know we weren't told enough about this ahead of time. The goals were unclear, and the intelligence was not good, and we have equipment issues, and we didn't go into this war the right way, all those kind of issues. So there is a question about how much of this, anger is directed back at their leadership. I think there definitely is going to be a reduced trust in kind of the senior Russian leadership and the military. And I think, a broader issue is that when you look at why this war is not going well, you can only really point to the senior leadership of the Russian government, because this is Putin. This is the system he developed. And one of the really big parts about Russia is that they always talk about how important it is to be great power status. Well, a really key component of great power status under Putin was, here's the Russian military. We rebuilt it. It was in a bad state. Now it's strong. Now it's respected. Look at these hypersonic missiles, all those kind of things. Well, it's not performing well. And that's for a variety of reasons, some of which are just the leadership side of how they conduct this war. But ultimately, it comes back to there's going to be an issue with, are we still respected? Are we this great power? How do we deal with this kind of national humiliation that we kept saying we should be doing well, we're not doing well? I'm not sure they respond to that, but it is a significant problem, and the only people you can blame are the people in the senior leadership of the Russian government. And when you look at the Russian military, Shoigu, Gerasimov, they've been in charge for a decade now. And should they have been in charge that long? Should they have rotated people? Probably. And all those kind of things now come back when you look at the system that Putin has developed. There are a lot of questions about who let this happen. Well, there's kind of a few people you point at, and I think that's again one of the big problems for Putin going forward, is that I think he knows that.
So last question, Heather, and we'll open things up. There's obviously been a remarkable U.S. policy response to this crisis. The cooperation with the Ukrainians, the sharing of intelligence in advance globally, the creation of this coalition of countries that see this, in fairly black and white terms, and a unusual focus on sanctions as kind of the thing that's going to lay low the Putin regime. And during this period, Russia's essentially had its role in the global economy stripped away. Putin has basically set his economy on fire. Yep. And U.S. and European policymakers have done just a number on Vladimir Putin. It's a stunning case study of how effective U.S. leadership can really galvanize a global response. But sanctions are not going to fix our Putin problem. I don't mean to put my views out there front and center, but I'm curious if that's your sense as well, that there is something about Putin's hold on power and role on the global stage that sanctions are not going to be sufficient to deal with.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the sanctions now, the EU just announcing their 6th round of sanctions, this is getting harder now, because this is now allies putting their economy on the line. I mean, obviously, we're feeling that pressure here as well with gas prices and things like that. So this gets harder the more we have to go. And again, if we are not going to put forces in Ukraine, the sanctions in some ways become the alternative to putting your military forces in. So they have to be extremely robust. Again, this speaks to, again, the miscalculations that are happening, because quite frankly, due to extraordinary technical capabilities of the Russian government, and I think we can't, the part of this question, Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov, they've miscalculated this war, but the technocrats, the Russian central bank governor, Mishustin, I mean, they are technically balancing all of these things and have done a masterful job, in fact, with the ruble being back at pre-war levels. Now they've instituted capital controls, but come the summer and the fall, this is when those sanctions, they can't resupply anything. Those shelves are going to be empty. That's when they really bite. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, what strategic gain? I mean, the irony is, in part, there are lots of complexities about why Putin invaded Ukraine, but in one of those was to try to recover from what he viewed was the great humiliation of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He invades again to have a greater humiliation. A weakened economy, a weakened military. And so, again, this is where we're trying to grapple with, what does Russia's decoupling from the international system, what does that look like in the future? And this is, again, where the China factor comes into play. So it's such an important role, because does China, in fact, want a very weak Russia? cheap energy, they're already buying at deep, deep discounts. Agricultural lands, that's great. Critical minerals, that's great. Or does China want a Russia that is strong and can be able to be with it, in shoulder to shoulder in trying to shape the international system to its policy preferences? That's what we don't know. But it's very clear from a demographic decline, COVID, this incredible loss of life in the military, the economics of this picture, it was already not so great for Russia in the future. The cutoff of Europe of buying Russian energy completely, changes Russia's economy. By 2030, I don't know what it looks like other than providing gas and energy to China, to India. It's going to be in dire straits. So this fragility, this fragmentation, this highly unstable Russia that may not be able to hold itself together is a scenario we really have to think about quite hard and to make sure we're protected from that instability.
So a lot of food for thought. Thank you to Heather Connolly. Thank you to Rob Lee.